Shalom, friends. This is Daniel Strong. We're going to discuss another very interesting topic. This audio teaching is titled "The Nature of Wolves." It was inspired to me. I was inspired to do this project by a good friend of mine that I found on Scott's blog at profoundprophecy.com. His project was called The Fruit of Wolves, but I felt led to make one called The Nature of Wolves. We both used the same source, the scriptures. I'm just going to phrase it a little differently in my very interesting way. And I hope that you guys have an easy time following along. Please, if you have your scriptures, have them open with you and take notes, because we're going to cover a lot of ground here. We are going to be discussing what is the biblical definition of a wolf. Many times in whatever religious circles that we've come from in our background, we throw out certain phrases like, you're a wolf, you're a false prophet, you're a false teacher, you're a heretic, etc., etc. We throw out these phrases, but we don't necessarily mean what the biblical definition of what those phrases mean. So without the absolute biblical definition of certain phrases, whether negative or positive relating to one's character, we will always make those phrases relative, meaning they can mean whatever we want them to mean in whatever situation that we're in. But we have to remember that when we're using words or phrases, we must present those phrases and those words according to their absolute definition. There are no relative definitions for those things. So what we're going to do is discuss one phrase is a wolf. What is the biblical definition of a wolf? One of the most common mistakes that we tend to make is that when reading scripture, people often forget that we need to define the terminologies found in the New Testament, quote unquote, through the lenses of the Old Testament, also known as the Tanakh. By defining terminologies using only the New Testament, we will never fully understand the context of them. We will also lack more understanding concerning what Yeshua and the disciples were trying to teach us. And for those out there that are new of hearing about this certain concept, I'm going to try my best throughout this audio teaching to refrain from using the terms Old Testament and New Testament, because those phrases were coined in there by an early 2nd century heretic known as Marcion, who was a Gnostic, but not going off on a tangent there. He is the one responsible for dividing the Bible up into Old and New Testament, the pages in our scriptures that do not belong there. It's one testament, one word. The entirety of his word is truth. Yahweh is unchanging. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So I'm going to call the Old Testament by its real name, called the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Scriptures, and I'm going to call the New Testament the Messianic Scriptures, or the Brit Hadashah, called the New Covenant or Renewed Covenant, or Messianic Scriptures is easier. So now that I'm going to lay that foundation, you're going to know what I mean by Messianic Scriptures relating to New Testament, and Tanakh relating to the Old Testament. So moving on. Here are some fun examples that I like to always have a little fun with our study group on Shabbats. How many of you guys have heard the phrase, he's a chicken? Very common in our culture. How many of you guys out there listening to this know that he's a chicken or she's a chicken does not literally mean that person is a two-legged animal with feathers? In our culture in America, that is an idiomatic expression relating to one's character. It means that someone's a coward or afraid, or in the old English you'd call them yellow. How about this one? That person is the bomb. This one's a little newer in my generation, but yeah, that person is the bomb that does not mean that person is a literal ticking time bomb that's going to explode. In its idiomatic expression, it means that person is the best at something. Like Michael Jordan is the bomb at basketball. He's the best, but he's not a literal explosive device. Here's another one. That person is sweet. We say this a lot to our loved ones or those that we highly esteem. It does not mean that they taste like sugar. It means in our culture that person is very nice. Another one, that person is dirty. Now, in our culture, that does not literally mean that person has a hygiene problem. Maybe, but the context is what defines the phrase. In context, according to its idiomatic expression in our American culture, the phrase, that person is dirty, literally means that person is profane. How about this one? That person is cold. Then when we say that in our idiomatic expression, in our culture and context, it does not mean that person has a temperature problem. It means that person is harsh, as if someone had a cold shoulder. The above phrases, or the phrases that I just list, he's a chicken, that person is the bomb, that person is sweet, that person is dirty, that person is cold, etc. Those phrases are what is called idiomatic expressions that describe people and their character. They are not to be taken literally. They are figurative. Without being familiar with our American culture or the American culture, a person outside of our culture in America could take the phrases that we just went over completely out of context. Each of the phrases that we just went over have absolute definitions. Apart from their cultural context, the phrases we just discussed will be relative to one's interpretation. In other words, if the context if the absolute definition according to the context in the phrase he's a chicken means somebody's a coward, well, if there's no absolute definition, what's a chicken to you might be something else, and what's a chicken to me might be something else. But both of us can't be right because there's one context in which that phrase is used at a certain time, and that's the context we need to properly find and define the word according to that context. So if somebody says, he's a chicken in the context of calling someone a coward, and then I come along and say, oh, to me, what that means is he's calling another person an animal. But then somebody else comes along and says, no, to me, he's calling somebody a coward. Well, both of our opinions cannot be correct because there's one context of which that word is being used, or that phrase is being used. So we got to find the absolute context of the phrase. Phrases can't be relative. There are also idiomatic expressions, just like the phrases that we just briefly discussed. There are expressions just like that found in Scripture that describe people. The idiomatic expressions found in Scripture also have absolute definitions, just like the ones we use in America. Now with that, the term wolf and wolves are also idiomatic expressions found in the Scriptures. Therefore, the term wolf and wolves have absolute definitions. Also, apart from context, the idiomatic expressions found in Scripture will also be relative, just like the phrases in our culture will be relative if we do not use them in its proper context. Here's the main question that I want to ask you guys out there. Now, with that little bit of, background in expressions of phrases that are idiomatic, let's ask ourselves again, what is the biblical definition of a wolf?